Okay, Cantor Nimi has something extra special for us. Well, Cantor Nimi always has something extra special, but I think today it may be extra, extra special. Cantor?
So I was every time I was studying Psalm 14, my mind kept getting drawn back to this piece of liturgy from Elah, Ata noten yad lefoshim. And I was trying to think about why I was so drawn back to this piece of liturgy, and it kind of occurred to me over the weekend. In my mind, at least, the speaker of Psalm 14 is looking around and seeing, you know, is exasperated by the futility of there being no goodness in the human beings around them, whereas the speaker of this piece of liturgy has kind of internalized of futility and exasperation that none of our actions are worth anything and that there's no goodness in us, and thinking that that's how God sees us. And so there's a little bit of that just absolute kind of despair that's expressed, and Israel Alter captures some of that futility and that exasperation. I will say that the part of this liturgy also does come in the daily morning service, in the preparatory prayers in Birchot HaShachar, where it's indented. So I wanted just to share this with you all a little bit, and I'll when we sing out, I'll abbreviate it. It's about just a little bit, 2.5 minutes or so. Ata noten yad lefoshim, v'minecha feshuta lekabel shavim. ותלמדנו אדוני אלוהינו להתוודות לפניך על כל עוונותינו, למען נחדל מעושק ידינו, ותקבלנו בתשובה שלמה לפניך, כאישים וכניחוחים למען דבריך, אשר אמרת. אין קץ לחובותינו, ואין מספר לניחוחי אשמתנו, ואתה תולה יודע שאחריתנו רימה ותולע. לפיכך הרבית סליחתנו, מענו מחיינו, מחסדנו, מה צדקתנו, מה ישועתנו, מה כוחנו, מה גבורתנו, מה נאמר לפניך, אדוני אלוהינו ואלוהי אבותינו ואמותינו. הלא כל הגיבורים כעין לפניך, ואנשי השם כלא היו, וחכמים כבלי מדע, ונבונים כבלי השכל, כי רוב מעשיהם טוב, וימי חייהם הבל לפניך, ומותר האדם מן הבהמה אין. Yihakol Havel.
Oh, so gorgeous. Thank you. And again, seeing how the music brings out those meaning of the words, that's a fantastic example and beautifully, beautifully sung for us. Thank you so much. So we are continuing. Oh, my door is opening. We're continuing on Psalm 14. Okay, I think we're going to look at altar today.
Okay.
And if folks have in front of you, if you could have it, since altar doesn't have on the page, if you could have a Hebrew version in front of you, if you read the Hebrew, because I'll refer back to why and what altar is doing in his particular translations.
All right, let me get this up.
Yeah. And I did want to, we'll get to this at the end. Okay, great. So Robert Alter is the great translator of biblical poetry and biblical literature in general. And again, just to remind you, he tries very hard to, in English, capture what he believes the Hebrew was going for. So while and sometimes that means not using a normal word in English, or structures, but he's trying to get as close as possible, since he is fluent in the Hebrew and he has done a great deal of study of every single one of the words. He is the one who's going to work hardest of all those we study to try and get what the intent was, not necessarily what his personal feelings are. So he's going for intent of the original psalm, but by really trying to use the English to get there, to make the English meaningful. So we start with verse 4, and again, this is a 7-verse psalm. 14 is a 7-verse psalm. And again, remember, we always have that question, what does Lama Natseach mean? Does it mean some kind of leader, some kind of victor, some kind of commander? Clearly for Alter, he's translating this as some kind of musical leader, as by saying leader, L-E-A-D-E-R, not L-I-D-E-R. That by saying lead player, he is answering the question from his perspective, that he believes this to be related to music, and this is an instruction in some way that we don't totally understand to the lead instrumentalist, to the lead player, kind of like the first violin. So, but what he does do is that he sees the superscription as part of the psalm. So you see what he's doing for the lead player for David. He's putting into the first psalm. He is not cutting it off and seeing it just as a superscription that has nothing to do with the psalm itself. So again, I'm just trying to repeat this so you get used to seeing this and understanding how different folks relate to the psalm itself. You, when you write your own, have full permission to do it in whatever way works for you. So Naval, remember we talked about the word Naval, which is an interesting word, and he's standing as the scoundrel has said in his heart, Ein Elohim, there is no God. Now notice, most of the Psalms with the parallelism have two phrases. He's breaking this Psalm up into more than that, and his formatting is very significant. This is not just to fit on the page kind of formatting. So he's reading it as Amar Navel Belibo, the scoundrel has said in his heart, quote, Ein Elohim, there is no God. End quote. Hishchitu, they corrupt, they make loathsome their acts, period. Ein oseh tov, there is none who does good. So the first is this sentence about there is no God because of all of this that the scoundrel sees around. And Alter says in his comment, and I'm just going to read this comment out loud because this question of who the scoundrel is and what is this there is no God. The thrust of this line is more moral than theological. The concern is not a philosophical question of God's existence, but the scoundrel's lack of conscience, his feeling that he can act with impunity because he thinks he doesn't have to fear divine retribution. This psalm then is a quote-unquote prophetic psalm, lacking any supplication, because the speaker who denounces the society he observes does not put himself forth as a victim. Now that's, if you have the altar, you can read this. So that's a very interesting understanding of this psalm. Again, nobody has to look at altar as the only way to look at the psalm, but it is for sure an interesting way to look at it. So in other words, this is a scoundrel, using the word naval instead of somebody who is in pain. Think of the other speakers we've had in other psalms who have experienced corruption and evildoers and horrible things in the world. They're full of pain. This guy doesn't seem to be full of pain at all. He's just saying there's no justice, no God. Verse 2. So that's a very interesting read of this, and it reminds us that different people respond very differently to some of the same set of circumstances in society. Yud He Vav He Mi Shemayim Hishkif al Bnei Adam. So notice that altar, whenever the name for God is the four-letter name of God, the tetragrammaton, the Shem HaMeforash, he will use the, oh God, Harold, I can't remember. What is that, lower caps?
Initial caps, small caps.
Initial cap, small cap. So you see the way Lord is written here is altar's way of telling us the original Hebrew was the Yud He Vav He. So he is giving us a hint in the English so we could go back and know this is different than the God of verse 1, which is not Yud He Vav He. We know that because altar is very careful in the English what word he uses. When he uses God, it's the Hebrew word Elohim. When he says Lord, it's the big name for God. So Yud He Vav He, the Lord looks from the heavens, Mishamayim, Hishkif al Bnei Adam, looks down. Bnei Adam means literally the sons of Adam, is the name for the primordial human being, the first person, and he's translating this as the sons of humankind or the children of humanity, or just, you could even say humanity, but he's saying sons of humankind. To see, so Yud He Vav He is looking down on humanity to see. Hayesh maskil. Remember the word maskil from the word seichel for a common sense, or haskalah for enlightenment. And a maskil in modern Jewish history is somebody who is a believer in the Enlightenment. A maskil is a very important person in modern Jewish history because they're a believer in the Enlightenment. Versus a mitnaged, or there are other words for the people who remain. In other words, somebody who stops being religious, is very connected to science, rational thinking. So to see, but in this case, maskil doesn't mean the Enlightenment, because if the Enlightenment didn't happen in the time of Psalms, but somebody who is discerning, doresh et Elohim, someone who is seeking out God. All right, let me do another couple of psukim and then we'll open it up. 3. Hakol sar, everyone turns away. Yachdav ne'elchu, together they are befouled is an interesting word, or corrupt, or confused. It's a very negative. Ein oseh tov, there is no one doing good. Ein gam echad, a repetition of that, not even one doing good. Daled 4. Halo yadu, do they not know? Kol po'olei aven, all wrongdoers. Now again, look at the formatting. Each break here is indicating one of the pausal forms, showing the biblical parallelism, so we could look from one phrase and see how it reflects back on the other. Ochlei ami, devourers, eaters, those who consume my people, ochlu lechem, devoured them like bread. Yud He Vav He lo kara'u, they did not call, and now we know because of the spelling of Lord, the reference back is Yud He Vav He. 5. Sham, there, pachadu fachad, they were afraid. They did sorely fear. The word sorely is added here because pachadu, pachad is a repetitive emphatic. Ki Elohim Bador Tzaddik. For God is with the righteous generation or the righteous category. So they did sorely fear. Now, there did they sorely fear. 6, Atzat Oni. So Oni is poor, and remember the Sepharia didn't use the word poor, but this is very important, I think, because the poor are often used in the Psalms as those who deserve the support of the righteous. In your plot against the poor, you are shamed. And again, we have Yud He Vav He, because Yud He Vav He shelters the poor. Let's go on to 7, the final verse. Ki iten mitzion, oh, may Zion come Israel's rescue. When Yud He Vav He restores his people's condition, may Jacob exalt, may Israel rejoice. And of course, Jacob and Israel are referring to the same biblical character, born as Jacob and becomes Israel because he goes through a process of discovering Yud He Vav He. So, overall, looking at this psalm, we don't have any of the agony that we've experienced, for instance, in many of the psalms, right? And that's what Alter is pointing to. We don't have the ad ana until when, God. We don't have any of the beseeching. It's a very different feel to the psalm, although for sure it is describing the same kind of evil that the psalmist in 13 was experiencing viscerally. Okay, so let me open it up to questions or comments.
All right, Dean put something into chat very early on. She said, I think it's the question of who is speaking, and she says, is the scoundrel the prophetic voice in this psalm?
Interesting point. To be called a prophetic psalm, it doesn't require somebody in the psalm being the prophetic voice. It could be the psalm itself is making a point. Like a piece of wisdom psalm, like of Psalm 1, which is part of a wisdom psalm. It's giving us advice. It's not necessarily who the speaker is. But that's a very interesting question. We could read it that way, I think.
All right. When I saw it, I thought, or is this anonymous voice of the psalmist here talking about the scoundrel?
Uh-huh. That's
Is
good
it-
too. I like that also.
Ben Shafran.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I very much like the way this particular translation, from all the other ones that he has, that the English follows the Hebrew syntax,
Yes.
and yet comes out synthetically okay, even in the English, and very poetic. It's very pronounced in this translation.
And that is Alter's goal. Ben, Alter would be very happy to hear you see that in his work, because that is exactly what he's going for. He wants to stay very close and reflect the Hebrew, both vocabulary-wise, but also in syntax, but he wants it to make sense in English. But the English, he's looking for English that will help the English he writes will be a refraction through which we can get to the Hebrew. Absolutely correct. He is of all of those we look at, including Sepharia, including Art Scroll. He's not looking for literal. He's looking for something that will most deeply reflect syntactically and literally the Hebrew, but he goes for English that will be poetic also. This makes Alter a very important resource whenever you're looking at biblical texts, and his understanding and his goal. And as Harold and I have both said, Alter has his introduction in this book, as well as he has a whole book on. And Ben, you might be interested in this. It's a little dense, but if you know Hebrew, it's a lot easier to follow. Can you see this book? The Art of Bible Translation by Robert Alter. It's not a big book, and he really,
Let me write it down.
he really he takes the chapter he has to begin his Psalms book is a very good introduction. Again, it's a little dense, but he explains exactly what he's going for, which, Ben, you have just done in 2 sentences.
Thank you.
Sue Mears.
Hi, I'm confused a little bit about the extreme fear, where I feel like the psalm is saying no one fears God. You know, like there's no God, we're acting sinfully with no fear of repercussion. But then there's this extreme fear. Who is it that's feeling that fear, or what is that implying?
That's a very good question. I'm not sure, and I think we'll see some interesting explorations of that with the different what you call it, with the different translations we see. That's one of the mysteries of this psalm. Who exactly is speaking? Who are they talking about? Whoever is speaking, who are they talking about? I'd say it's not totally clear. So go for it. See what makes sense for you. I think it's not so clear, and that's why the final verse, as somebody said when we went over it, and so I can't remember who said it. Verse 7 is a lot like is quite different than the rest of the psalm, as we've seen sometimes before. The final verse seems quite different, right? But it's giving us a sense. It for sure, verse 7 seems to tell us, well, you might be in a moment in time where there looks like there's no goodness. Yud Hey Vav Hey, even in those moments there will be some rescue. But good point. I'd say it's not totally clear. You have to play with it to find out what makes it meaningful for you.
Sherry or Simon?
Actually, you have both of us this time. It's similar to a question other people have asked, which is in the first stanza, it's clear that when it's the scoundrel saying there is no God, but the next line, they corrupt, they make both of them their acts. Rabbi, I think you may have already addressed this, but again, specifically, who's talking there?
Yeah, it's not really clear. I think we have to play with it to figure that out. Try on different answers to that. So it's not totally clear. One could say it's not really clear.
Okay, I think
It could be the silent narrator, or the invisible. What do you call that? The
Omniscient?
yeah, this is the omniscient narrator. We don't really know. It's not clear, and in some psalms it is really clear who's speaking and when, and in some psalms we have to just play with it and try on different answers to that.
So I was taken by Alter's discussion of the form, the technique that Ben was mentioning too, and especially in the second verse where the psalmist uses enjambment, which the psalmist doesn't usually use. And
Yes.
enjambment is when you take a line and you actually finish the line on the next line. So you're emphasizing that difference.
Let's look at that. Let's look at the line verse 2 while you talk about that, because that's exactly, yep.
The Lord from the heavens looked down on the sons of humankind, and then to see.
Yeah.
Is on the next line. So seeing and discerning and looking down. It's almost like a cascade of his looking down from
Yes.
line to line, and especially because when they say there's no God, and then you see God is absolutely there, looking down and cascading down upon us.
Uh-huh.
And the other part of that Alter mentioned that I think is very unique to the psalm, although later on it may not be, there may be others, is this idea that in the Hebrew there are in, say, verse 3, there is brevity, the 2 beats, 4 syllables in each in the Hebrew, and he uses that a little bit. All turn astray.
Aha.
All turn astray, and that all together be fouled isn't exactly 4 syllables, but still it's very truncated.
Uh-huh. Very interesting.
It's very unique too, because the lines are usually longer. So
Yep.
those are.
And see, and that's a great, great, great point, Sharon. So Alter is really trying to preserve that which is in the Hebrew through his English poetry here. Beautiful.
Sarah Siegel?
I was thinking that that 13 and 14, which seem at first glance to be such a jarring difference from each other, may not be. Maybe it's an alternate strategy by the Psalm 13 person. I know that many of the Psalms begin with Lamanatseach LeDavid, but it's more LeDavid, but still, they both begin that way. But I'm going to mess up something on the translation. I'm going too far with it. On Psalm 13 and 5, it says it's not the same shoresh as ochel, right? It's yachol is to be able, as opposed to ochel is eat.
No, it's
right?
the same shoresh as
they're not the same shoresh, right?
They are the same shoresh. This is yeah. Ochel is aleph chaf lamed. That's what the shoresh is. Yachol doesn't have a aleph in it. This shoresh aleph chaf lamed means to eat. So, or devour. There used devour. So it is the same shoresh. Sarah,
Rabbi,
did I lose you? Did we lose Sarah?
I'll go to Ben Kushner for a minute.
I think we lost Sarah.
Yeah.
Okay.
That happens. Ben Kushner goes to line 7 with the reference to O may from Zion come Israel's rescue, and says, since there is a reference to Zion, could this have been a reference to the diaspora if written when Jews were in exile, which I guess raises the question of the use of Zion in Psalms as a whole.
Well, that's so it's not just the use of the word Zion, because Zion can also mean Jerusalem. And Zion doesn't necessarily mean the diaspora, because Zion means Jerusalem usually. But the use of the word Beshuv Yud Vav He Shvut Amo, the captivity, which is Shvut Amo, is often means some kind of captivity. That usually is seen as referring to the Babylonian exile, which is, as I said, one of the reasons this psalm is seen as being written hundreds of years after David existed. But Zion can mean Jerusalem in the Bible.
All right. Lori Krotman.
I was really struck by the difference in the first line with the Sepharia translation. It's one thing if God does, if there is no God, but it feels far worse that God doesn't care. And you said this wasn't a psalm of despair, but I found this to be the most depressing psalm I read.
Well, I don't mean it's not a psalm full of despair and depression, but it's a step removed, because it's not an individual expressing their despair, like we saw in Psalm 13, for instance. Ad ana, how long will I cast about? How long will sorrow be in my heart? It's not a personal expression of despair. It doesn't mean it's not depressing to read, because boy, is it depressing.
Thank you.
Lisa Brown.
Hi. So just a couple of things, so, I mean, first of all, the psalm reminds me of Isaiah, which starts out with all of the, just prophecies doom, and then he ends with conciliations. But also, the way Alter has written this is really the way I've been reading it, is that he it's not so much what they're doing, which is, some of these translations are that their acts are bad, but Alter says something really different. It's that there's nothing good about their acts. So it's not really the acts themselves. It's the way that they're doing their acts. And if I can digress, I mean, like, I always think of Republicans this way, like they have a real talent for doing the right thing for the wrong reasons. It's like, we should know how many undocumented people are living in our country, but not so that we can persecute them and throw them out. So, I mean, it's why are you doing what you're doing? And the first part, which I've really stuck on, the first part of this psalm is in He feel. It's all causative. And then for the last, first couple of psukim, and then the end is all kal, right? So it's just sort of that. So I'm always interested in knowing why. This is where my own Hebrew knowledge leaves off greatly. It's like, why do they choose the binyanim that they choose to write in? And some of it is just convention, I would imagine. But if it's a little geeky, but if you ever wanted to talk about like how they choose the binyanim.
Well, first of all, binyanim are the forms that the Hebrew verbs are built in. But you can, to some degree, you can't overthink it. Sometimes it's just not every Hebrew verb exists in every binyan. That's what we Americans learn when we start learning Hebrew, and you get to that. It's like, and there are some shorashim which do exist in all binyanim, but not all do. And so in some cases, the simplest answer, which is the most interesting in some ways, is that that's the binyan that verb exists in, and it doesn't exist in every single binyan. So you have to be careful not to overthink it. And hifil is not itself what we learn when you're starting in a binyan, when we're starting to learn grammar, is that each binyan has a very specific meaning, and that meaning is always the same with every verb form it exists. That, of course, is an overstatement, but when you're starting to learn it, you learn the overstatement. So I think you're overreading this for this particular psalm, but sometimes it is meaningful. That's all I can say, is that it gets complicated.
And Rabbi, for those of us who are in Aleph plus or Beit, binyan.
Binyan, literally, it's from the word to build something, and it's theoretically every Hebrew verb, and again, as I said, in some theoretical level it exists, but in the reality it doesn't. You can take the same shoresh, put it in a different binyan, and the different binyan will. So, for instance, the classic one that's used is shin bet resh, and in the simplest verb it means to break, but in other verbs it can mean to shatter, or if it's hifil, which is the one that's being raised right now, it means it's usually a causative, which means somebody else is doing it to something else. But it's you can't just apply it everywhere.
Sarah Hoshan.
I'm sorry. I would just say that although Alter does, I'll just leave it there.
Yeah. I'm saying he does do it there, but I'm saying I'm not sure it's significant that those verbs are in hifil and the others are in kal.
Okay, thank you.
But excellent to notice and excellent to ask these questions.
Which I think also this conversation just shows the rest of us who are not quite yet up to all of our binyanim, not binyamin, that there is a level of skill that goes into reading the Hebrew and trying to figure out which exact form the Hebrew verb is in, which informs its meaning and its translation.
And it's one of the reasons why you've heard me say that Hebrew is considered in the land of linguistics, and I'm not a linguist, is considered a verbal language as opposed to English, which is considered a nominal language or a language. The strength of English is in the vocabulary, in the nouns that we have. I think there are 300,000 words in English. Most Americans use 5,000 to give you a sense of how slim our vocabulary is, but Hebrew is considered a verbal language. The strength and beauty of Hebrew poetry and of Hebrew language is how a verb gets used, precisely because there are these 7 binyanim, these 7 different ways to take a shoresh. And when a great Israeli poet writes poetry, even they can make up new words all the time by using binyanim in clever ways. And an Israeli who has never heard that word before will immediately understand the meaning because they know what the goal of the binyan is, so to speak. So Hebrew is extremely creative and nimble. I'm not sure what the different words are when it comes to the verbs. Hebrew vocabulary, the number of Hebrew words are actually quite small. When it comes to nouns in Hebrew. That's why biblical Hebrew is actually not as difficult to master as one might imagine, because there's a fairly for most biblical passages outside of poetry, there's a and there is a finite number, but that finite number is fairly manageable. The difficulty, of course, is poetry, because poets use words in different ways, and poetry is harder to figure out. But the verbs in Hebrew are exactly as Lisa was getting at. The verbs can be very exciting to understand the meaning.
Sarah Hirschon.
I forget which line it is right now, but I'm really struck by that line about when the psalmist is discussing the poor and those who go against the poor, and again, this is where my Hebrew knowledge really lets me down, but I'm working on it. What type of poor are we talking about? Are we talking about more financially poor or more religiously poor? Because I mean, it works in both contexts.
Yes.
But it's still really interesting. And as I think was mentioned, I can't help but think of some of the way politics is, and the way really a lot of some politicians will attack people and stuff like that. I forget which line.
In biblical Hebrew, oni, it's in line 6, verse vav, pasuk vav. Oni is a very classic Hebrew word for poverty, for poor, or downtrodden. It doesn't typically have a religious meaning in biblical Hebrew. I don't know if the Hebrew speakers here could speak about modern Hebrew, whether oni has anything, but it really means poverty or downtrodden or yeah, in the Bible. I don't know if our modern Hebrew speakers want to say something about that.
Al?
I have nothing to add. I don't think it has any other meaning.
Yeah, but it's a very common word. It's used to mean poor, literally poor. It's certainly in biblical Hebrew, but it's also used all the time about who should be protected. It's a word that, who should be, which is why, by the way, tzedakah in Hebrew, or in Jewish law, the giving of charity, which it gets translated as charity, is really about alleviating poverty. You don't get Jewish charity benefits, tzedakah, for giving to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, as meaningful as, and some of us do give money to the Met, which we love to do, and it might be a tax deductible donation, but according to Jewish law, tzedakah has to do something about feeding poor people, making sure poor people are taken care of. It has a very specific, we are obligated, every single Jew is obligated to give a significant amount of our income to help poor people. The oni is a very important category in Jewish life.
Rabbi, if I could just come in for a minute. I have this vocabulary guide to biblical Hebrew.
Oh yeah,
Has,
can I see it? Let me see.
Yes, of course you can.
Where are you, Harold? I have to find Harold.
I'm here, my little box.
Your little
My little box. It's the Van Pelt and Pratico, and it says that there are 1,900 words in this book, and it says they will enable a student to recognize 90% of all the words appearing in the Hebrew Bible. 50, the most frequently used 50 words make up 55% of the words that used in the Hebrew Old Testament. So you're right.
That's what I mean. It's a very small, it's obviously finite because there are only so many books, but even within the word finite, it's a really,
Right.
and that's, one year, so I don't know if some of you were in that class, I taught these Joseph narratives, which are the last chapters of the book of Genesis. And you can learn the vocabulary to study the Joseph narratives in Hebrew with a pretty compact number of nouns.
Right.
And again, poetry are the words that are outside those 50%, they're the words that are used once in the whole Bible, but that's a great number to know. So feel encouraged.
Yes. Robin Baslaw.
So I'm in this psalm in particular, I'm noticing the pattern of relating the good and the bad, and kind of a follow-up, that last line where it says, Lord restores the fortunes of his people. That's Sepharia, and here it's restores his people condition. are we restoring a spiritual condition? Because that seems like that's how we reconnect in this psalm. It's all about that total disconnection from God. I don't know if you follow. That's my
Yeah, it's a
question.
big question. I think it's a great question, and let's look and see how the more those who are looking at this psalm spiritually try to understand that. It's a great question.
Donna Gray. And then I think we may be at the end of today's
Okay.
discussion.
Hi. So I'm looking at the end, and when it says, may Jacob exult, may Israel rejoice. When I was talking about this in my Hevruta, it occurred to me that maybe it's not just talking about the same person, but may Jacob, the person, exalt, and may Israel, the people of Israel, rejoice. But then I was also thinking about, I like Laurie Krotman, I found this just completely depressing, this psalm. And, you know, if the psalmist says that everyone is a scoundrel, that includes himself.
Uh-huh.
I mean, you know, like in a lot of the other psalms, it's like, it seems like the psalmist is aligning himself with the righteous. But in this case, who are the righteous? Nobody.
And I don't mean to say when I say it's, and I think Alter used the word psalm of supplication, it's not written from the perspective of somebody who is in despair. And like we saw in Psalm 13, you'll see a big difference. I'm not saying it's a psalm of exaltation or praise, or like Psalm 92 or any of the psalms of Kabbalat Shabbat or Psuke de Zimra. Obviously, it's not that. I'm not saying it shouldn't be depressing. It's just it's not, the speaker is not saying this and then saying ad ana, until when, how will I survive? It's not from that place. It's not, I don't mean to say this is a psalm of exaltation or of praise like Psalm 150. Obviously not. It's a very bleak look at humanity. Absolutely true.
Including the psalmist.
Yes. Yes, the psalmist is not saying, yeah. The psalmist is saying that as a result of looking around and seeing what the world looks like, my conclusion is there is no God.
So Rabbi, I'm trying to pull the screen down. Give me just a second. Something happened here. So for the rest, so I think it's 10:42 and we should stop the discussion for today.
So I wanted, yes, and so let's talk about tomorrow. So I hope those of you who are members received the condolence note that we have a funeral tomorrow. So the funeral I have to do tomorrow is at 10 a.m. So I won't be able to teach. And instead, tomorrow we're going to study in Chavruta some of the translations we have not yet gone to. So I'll be doing the funeral, but Harold and Tasha and Annika will, everybody will get divided up into groups of 3 after the musical introduction. And we're going to study, I think we're going to be doing tomorrow Fisher's Psalm 14 in Chavruta.
All right, so everybody who has the copy, the PDF or the book, please have your Fisher Psalm 14 because we cannot put it up on the screen when we're in our groups. And then Ira, are you here? Ira Rosenblum?
And I think you'll see, it'll be very interesting, these questions you've all raised today and last time. Let's see how Fisher engages with it. I think you'll be very interested. And then I'll be back on Wednesday and we'll finish up.
Right.
I am here, Harold.
Ira, do you have a tiny little teaser for us for tomorrow? What will you be teaching?
Well, let's just say I'm focusing on, we've done one of the 3 Bs so far, and we're going to move on to another one of the 3 great Bs. And that's all I'll say right now.
Okay. So if I were to hum happy birthday to you, it could give out another hint. All right, so we'll be together without the rabbi. Ira will be teaching us. It will be a very interesting teaching tomorrow. We'll be in Chavruta for 20 or 25 minutes. We'll come back. We'll discuss what we found out about. It's Fisher, correct, Rabbi?
Fisher tomorrow.
Fisher translation that we've studied.
And if you have in front of you the other translations, it'll be very interesting to see Alter or Sepharia. But
okay.
Yeah.
And then Wednesday, we'll be back to wrap up our study of Psalm 14 with the rabbi.
Right, and
there's no class on Thursday. next Monday and Tuesday, we will be studying the offerings for Psalm 14, which will be due at 5 o'clock on Sunday. And all of this has been in a email. And someone just asked, can I share the Fisher translation? Please, if I emailed the Fisher translation out to everybody when we started this. If I don't have your email, you need to check the email for the translations. If I don't have your email, or you're not getting the emails, please put it in chat now. But it is a little frustrating to send them out over and over and over and still be asked.
Harold already sent out all the translations, including the Fisher translation. So look in your group of translations you got.
All right, so if you do not have that email, or if you're not regularly getting the emails, put them in chat or email me. Otherwise, please just go back and look at your emails. And with that, Cantor, would you like to lead us out? Let me find your text.
Sure, and I won't do the whole thing this time. I'll start from right before the indentation at Lefichach, because it's a beautiful quote of the quintessential motif of the Ne'ilah music. But in particular, what I think was Donna said about how this could be referring to how the psalmist could be including themselves in this. I think another thing that drew me to this piece of liturgy is that it's almost as if you started to take some of the language from Psalm 14 and changed the theys to we's, it starts to line up a little bit, especially when it starts talking about people who lack scale a little bit further on in the paragraph, who lack intelligence or wisdom. So I'll start. Yeah, great. לפיכך הרבית סליחתנו אנו מחיינו מחסדנו מה צדקתנו מה ישועתנו מה כוחנו מה גבורתנו מה נאמר לפניך אדוני אלוהינו ואלוהי אבותינו ואימותינו הלא כל הגיבורים כעין לפניך ואנשי השם כלא היו וחכמים כבלי מדע ונבונים כבלי השכל כי רוב מעשיהם טוב ימי חייהם הבל לפניך מותר האדם מן הבהמה אין מהכל הבל.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, everybody. The room will stay open for a few minutes of schmooze time. And I'll miss you tomorrow, but I'll look forward to hearing also on Wednesday a little bit. Maybe you can report in a little bit about what the study was like. And have a wonderful day. Is Jacqueline on this in class today?
I did not see Jacqueline, although I see Sharon Golub.
Hi, no, Sharon Golub.
Jacqueline wasn't on.
Okay. All right. Bye-bye, everybody. Thanks for studying together today.
Saul,
Yeah,
can you explain to me what Benjamin means? I still don't understand it. Or somebody.
I can explain it. So, I mean, a binyan is
Or Binyam, whatever.
binyan, B-I-N-Y-A-N in English, but it means the literal meaning is building. But each verb in, not all verbs, this is what the rabbi was correcting me about, but many verbs in Hebrew and in English, right? This is also, so you can say the same verb. Like if I was going to say the word he said, like, so said is going to be written one way, and we write it one way in English too, right? He said, he says, he will say. I mean, these are all different ways of expressing this verb. And it's just, it means, and Hebrew does the same thing. They spell these words a little differently, except in Hebrew, what we have are mainly different vowels. But biblical Hebrew also has some parts of English, a different way of looking at the verbs. But so specifically, there's something called causative, which means, like when we say in Psalm 23, he makes us lie down, he causes us to lie down. That's expressed in a certain binyan, in a certain way that verb is built, right? So the verbs are built a certain way in order to express that tense. We call it tense. Biblical Hebrew, they call it aspect. But that would exactly what that means, past, perfect,
Okay, I understand that. All right.
So that's what it means. So what I was saying is that, so in Hebrew, there's something called hefil, which is causative. He makes us lie down, right? They make them act corruptly. And that's what I was bringing out. And the rabbi corrected me. And what she said was that, and also Cantronimi also corrected me, as well. And what she said is, look, not every verb is able to be expressed in all these different ways. And sometimes it just is what it is. That's basically what she says.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Lisa. I can now get on with my day.
Okay. Bye, guys. Nice meeting you all again.
Bye.